Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe. Today we talk with Dan Kovalik about his op-ed titled, "The West's Sole Prerogative is that Russia has no right to self-defense, even when the threat is right on its border." Daniel Kovalik teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and is the author of the book No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests. Dan Kovalik is here. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Dan. It's great to talk with you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So I saw your op-ed, and it's titled, just get the right title, "The West's Sole Prerogative is that Russia has no right to self-defense, even when the threat is right on its border." And I wanted to talk to you about that, particularly because, I could relate to it a lot because I also grew up in the late Cold War era, if you will. And we remember what things were like. I remember when most people thought that the chances for a nuclear war, for example, were significant. Not that we lived in constant fear, but it was always there, sort of hanging over us. I can remember, of course, I was wrapped up in college and things like that at the time. I can remember being really surprised when the USSR fell, if you will. And it seemed like things calmed down for quite a while, although we now know that there were, the shock therapy, and there were, I don't know if you call it exactly a regime change operation, but definitely an operation to try to grab assets in Russia and to influence, to bring them closer to the West, but not on their own terms, more on our terms. But still, things quieted down for quite a while. There didn't seem to be that much aggression. And then suddenly in the early 2010s, especially in the 2014 time period, the aggression ramped up drastically again. And all of a sudden, some of those old Cold War themes started coming back. And I know I was just shaking my head thinking, what's going on here? And one of the most, Stephen Cohen talked a lot about this. One of the most dangerous things about the way things are this time around is that Stephen Cohen used to always emphasize that there at least was a line drawn, hundreds of miles away from Russia's border at that point in time, in Germany. There was a big buffer area. But this time around, while people seem sort of less concerned in general, just the general public, about a Cold War, now we are right up on Russia's border, literally right up on Russia's border, which I think for people who lived through the last Cold War, this is kind of a shocking thing. And as you point out, we recognize our own sphere of influence, our own area of protection, if you will, but we don't allow that to Russia. And we just keep pushing and pushing. Now we're at the point where we're saying that we'd like to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Right.
And well, that's all I really need to say, just to introduce what kinds of things were going through my mind as I read through your op-ed.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, the first thing you said is that people had a fear of nuclear war during the first Cold War, if you want to call it that. And that's true. People don't seem to be concerned about that now. I mean, lay people. However, experts who care about the issue think we're closer to a nuclear war now than we were then.
Right.
That we're really is closer to a nuclear war than we've ever been with Russia. And the main group that keeps an eye on that is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who have the nuclear clock. I think they've now put it to like 3 seconds to midnight or something. I mean, because
they're running out of running out of time to, bring it closer.
because they're very concerned, and very few other people are concerned. The one person who's been raising concern about this is Tulsi Gabbard, who of course has been very much sidelined and mocked, even though she has a lot of very important, observations on the world, including on our relationship with Russia. I mean, here's how I see the relationship with Russia over the last years. I mean, there was a détente. Of course, Ronald Reagan famously called Russia and the Soviet Union the evil empire. He said he was going to destroy it. However, by about 1987 or so, he came to think that Gorbachev was a good guy, a sincere guy.
Right.
There started to be a rapprochement. Of course, by 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and you had a bunch of the Eastern Bloc countries leave the Soviet sphere with the approval of the Soviet Union, or at least assent. But as you say, the promise was given to Gorbachev, and this is well documented, that if he allowed the Berlin Wall to come down, and if he allowed Germany, which we have to remind people took 27 million Soviet lives during World War II, if he allowed Germany to reunite, then they promised, and I believe it was Secretary of State Baker who promised specifically, NATO would not move 1 inch past Germany. But no sooner was that promise made that NATO began to move eastward. Now it contains at least, this is in my article, that several former East Bloc countries and even 3 former Soviet republics.
Right.
And now, as you say, they want to bring Ukraine, which obviously is right on the border of Russia, into NATO as well. So this was a huge blow to Russia, of course, because they felt lied to, and they have been lied to on a number of occasions, and because they feel threatened by all this, particularly after the 2014 coup, which Obama supported in Ukraine, which brought to power an ultra-right-wing and anti-Russian government in Kiev, not only anti-Russian state, but anti-ethnic Russian government, which is now at war with the Russian ethnics in the east part of Ukraine. So obviously this is a huge concern to Russia. Now, so how it worked is the U.S. and Russia got along very well during the Yeltsin years, because Yeltsin was essentially a U.S. puppet.
Right.
Clinton famously intervened in the 1996 elections to get Yeltsin reelected. He had at some point like 3% approval rating or something. He bombed his own Congress, we have to remember, the Duma, and the U.S. didn't care about that. And again, Clinton intervened to help Yeltsin win in 1996. And again, all was well. And then when Putin was first elected, the U.S. was saying, well, he's a Yeltsin guy, so he must be okay. And there was a certain honeymoon period with Putin. And of course, George W. Bush would famously say that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and they were friends. And after 9/11, of course, Putin was the first world leader to call Bush and offer his condolences. He offered to help in the war on terror, which he did do. He lived up to that promise. And again, all was well, seemingly. I think one of the big breaking points, the first breaking points between the U.S. and post-Soviet Russia, came when Putin did not support the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. This was seen as, impertinent on the part of Russia and Putin. And this begins the descent of American-Russian relations. Another big, and then you had the Medvedev years. Remember that Putin and Medvedev have switched off as president. And again, Medvedev and the U.S. got along pretty well. Another big breaking point, though, came when Putin, well, on this end, when Obama and NATO bombed Libya from March of 2011 to October 2011, leading to the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, the breaking up of Libya as a solitary state, and really the descent of Libya into chaos. This was a big breaking point for Putin, who was very upset, again, felt betrayed. Russia and China felt betrayed because they supported, or at least abstained from the Security Council resolution, which granted NATO the right to create a safe zone over Libya. Air fly zone over
No
Libya.
fly zone, yeah.
No fly zone. And to protect, in the interest of protecting civilians. Well, they didn't protect many civilians. They protected some while killing others, of course. And it quickly descended into regime change, which both Russia and China believed they did not sign up for. So again, Putin felt betrayed here, and he felt alarmed that the U.S. was really out of control. So it's at this point that he decides that he's going to intervene in Syria, that he is not going to let Assad become another Muammar Gaddafi, another victim of NATO and Western aggression. And of course, the West, and the US in particular, were upset by that, by Putin's foray into Syria, which certainly was necessary from the Syrian government's point of view. I mean, that the Syrian government probably would not exist right now without that intervention. And truthfully, they'd probably look a lot worse. That's my view. It would have sunk into chaos and would have been overrun by these jihadists that the West has backed. And frankly, some of those jihadists came from Libya after they overthrew Gaddafi. So I think this is where we see the souring of relations, to the point then, of course, it just goes into madness, with the claim that somehow Putin, swung the 2016 election, which is absurd. But the lies have just gone on and on. Putin has been blamed from everything from, election interference to attacks on electric grids, which never happened, to influencing Colin Kaepernick to kneel, to stirring up the Charlottesville protests and counter-protests several years ago. He's been blamed for nearly everything, bad or whatever, neutral, that you could think of in the last several years. So Russia, anti-Russia hysteria is at its highest that it's ever been. In fact, Stephen Cohen said Putin has been vilified in no way that any other Russian leader has been vilified. Of course, Stalin and Roosevelt were allies in World War II. There's photos of them sitting together famously at Yalta. You have the famous photo of Kennedy hugging Khrushchev. Nixon got along fine with Brezhnev. Ultimately, Reagan got along with Gorbachev. So this vilification of a Russian leader is pretty incredible. And again, Cohen, he was Gorbachev's advisor. We should tell people that. And I believe knew Putin to some extent too. He said Putin's view was his reaction to all this was complete confounded. From Putin's point of view, it's like, I helped with the war on terror. I've offered help in other ways. For example, offered to work with the U.S. on the vaccines, for COVID. And yet, time and again, the U.S. slaps him down. And again, portrays him as some sort of evil, maniacal figure, with, of course, Biden recently calling him a killer. And so this is where we're at. We're to a point where now there is serious conflict on the Ukrainian-Russian border. The government in Kiev says it wants the Crimea back from Russia and is willing to take it forcefully, and wants NATO to help it do so. This is obviously incredibly dangerous. Russia is not going to give that up without a fight. And it should be noted, that even very mainstream Western sources like USA Today, have reported that the people in Crimea are very happy to be part of Russia, particularly after the 2014 coup when they did not feel safe. And there was a referendum held in Crimea, and they overwhelmingly voted to be part of Russia. So any attempt by Ukraine to bring Crimea back would not be supported either by the Crimeans, who themselves would probably resist this and be killed in large numbers if Ukraine and NATO were serious about returning. And frankly, the idea of bringing Crimea back into Ukraine by force would be, and for NATO and the US to call for that, would be similar to Russia calling for the US to give Puerto Rico back, either to itself or to Spain. This is silliness. No one would abide by this. But somehow the US thinks it can, where Russia wants a cushion at its border, western border in Eastern Europe, the US wants a cushion everywhere in the world. The US believes it has preeminence all over the world. And again, the idea that Russia would station troops in Mexico or Canada, this is absurd. This is inconceivable and laughable that could ever happen. And yet the Russians are supposed to be okay that NATO is now up to its border. And so this hypocrisy and this hubris that the US and the West have is dangerous. And of course, they project their own hubris onto Russia, right? All of the aggressive moves they make, they attribute to Putin. Somehow Putin is threatening NATO. How? By having troops where? In Russia. Within Russia, on Russia's own border, right? This is how absurd it is. I mean, makes no sense. And yet most Americans by now, particularly liberals, by the way, which is quite interesting, have bought into the idea that Russia is our enemy. It's interesting, less conservatives do, in part because, of the Russiagate, right? Russiagate was a liberal concoction, and the conservatives resisted that greatly, as they should have, frankly. And so you have this strange divide where it's the liberals who are much more, bellicose in terms of their rhetoric against Russia than the conservatives. So this is an interesting turn of events, but it's a dangerous turn of events. Of course, the other problem you have, which again has been forgotten, but it's a real problem. After the Soviet Union collapsed, central control over the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union ended. Each republic was now in control of the nuclear weapons in their country. And in fact, this was quite concerning, of course, to people truly concerned about US security, because they knew that this increased the likelihood of accidental nuclear war, right? And in fact, George W. Bush, I think Clinton started it and Bush continued it for a time, but then ended a program to help the former republics secure their nuclear weapons. Well, then he forgot about it. Bush forgot about it, particularly after 9/11, and it hasn't been picked up again. But the same problems remain, right? I mean, so we are really in danger of a nuclear war with Russia, more than we've ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet people are just whistling past the graveyard. It's really an incredible situation.
Yeah, I can remember I picked 2014 as the real turning point as to, and the years since then, where any kind of reasonable relationship with Russia just became less and less possible. And some of the people who follow Putin and are more pro-Putin, if you will, seem to think that there was a break just in recent years to where he just realized this is, any kind of alliance here is not going to happen. And all trust, was gone. And they, I guess, became more invested in their alliance with China. I I don't think it's probably possible for Russia and China to form this alliance in such a short period of time. There must have been some work on this prior to that, but it seems more solidified now. And as far as I know, this is the last thing any strategist ever wanted to happen. Uh, to have those two countries and possibly Germany. I mean, there are parts of Germany, as you can see from the Nord Stream pipeline, certainly some of the economic alliances. These are the things that were would have been considered the biggest possible threats, and yet in driving this conflict and this more and more control over Ukraine, or influence at least over Ukraine, that they actually made it happen, or at least made it happen faster. And that's curious, especially when you look at it from the Brzezinski standpoint. I mean, that
Nixon,
seems to
yeah.
be all blown out of the water now. Toward the
Yeah,
end of life, he seemed to shift his uh, ideas as well, although we didn't get to hear much more from him on that.
yeah,
So,
well, it is interesting, although, it does make you wonder then what is going on. It certainly was predictable that this would happen. I mean, Russia would certainly, it was predictable Russia would turn to China if the West turned on Russia, which they have. I mean, Putin would prefer to be in the West. He would prefer to be considered a Western nation. But the West continues to reject Russia as a Western nation. And that has been Russia's fate for a long time, going back a long time, certainly since the Napoleonic Wars, but even before that, and certainly since the Russian Revolution of 1917, as we're shortly after the U.S. and other capitalist armies invaded Russia to try to destroy it, and certainly after World War II, when the Cold War starts in earnest. Russia has been seen as an outsider, as an Oriental country, not as a Western country. And so it would be natural, of course, for Russia to team up with China, who they were teamed up with, of course, during the Cold War, two communist countries at that point, until around 1972, when Nixon and Kissinger very smartly triangulate and make a pact with Mao and China against Russia, which I always held against Mao for going along with, but he did. But it showed that China and Russia obviously have some mutual interests. So, but the question is, why would the West engage in acts that would predictably bring Russia and China back into the alliance that they had? I think it's because the West, and again, particularly the United States, wants a confrontation with both of those countries. They need an enemy. They need to justify the ridiculous amount of money that the U.S. spends on military every year. Terrorism fit that bill for a while, but then, of course, then the U.S. started backing terrorists. Well, as it had even back to the Mujahideen in 1979. But at some point, people weren't worried about terrorism anymore. So, they went back to the Russian bugaboo, the Chinese bugaboo, and that's where we're at. So, one, they need those countries as enemies to justify their continued military spending spree, if you will. But the other thing that's happening is that capitalism is in huge crisis, particularly because of the pandemic. The pandemic has only deepened the crisis that had already existed, but it has laid bare how bad that crisis is. When the U.S., the wealthiest nation in the world, which had shortly before the pandemic, been rated top in the world to deal with the pandemic, when it dropped the ball so bad, having the worst numbers, pandemic numbers, the highest number of cases, the highest numbers of dead due to the pandemic, the U.S. has been exposed as a fraud and a failure, and that its system is a failure. While China, on the other hand, shut that pandemic down pretty quickly, as did Vietnam. The socialist world has actually proven itself to be much more superior, at least in terms of that. But it's a very important thing to be superior. So the U.S. has been exposed as being not being a superpower when it comes to economics, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to its social fabric, which we're seeing every day has completely collapsed with mass shootings on a regular basis, protests daily in the streets. It's not a healthy country, right? And so I do think that there are some in the halls of power that believe another major war is necessary to get the world capitalist economy humming. And we may be seeing, the beginnings of such a war now. And that obviously for those of us who are sane and reasonable people, that is a quite frightening prospect. But I do think there are those who believe in this. The Atlantic Council, put out a white paper earlier this year urging regime change in China, for example. John Pilger a few years ago made a movie called the impending or upcoming war with China. I think both Russia and China are on the chopping block, possibly. Obviously, this would be a war that would be just devastating, especially if nuclear weapons were used either on purpose or by accident. But it seems that the powers in Washington are so crazy that they might risk that.
Yeah, I agree with you on some of those things, particularly it just seems like before when large changes, big changes, particularly economic and financial, were achieved through world wars. And it would certainly, I think there are people who want to pick the winners and losers. They don't like the way things are going at the moment. And they think that a world war might be a way to reset things. I've heard, I think it's Professor Wolf talk about this, about Richard Wolf, sorry. Talk about the failure of capitalism. I mean, if that's what we have, is this capitalism? It's some kind of strange looking.
Well, it's gangster capitalism.
If this is what you call free market, I mean, forget about that.
Yeah, we've never really had that. That's always been a myth.
An ideal, right?
Yeah, but it certainly is capitalism in the sense that it is ruled by the corporations. They rule this country in a very significant way, more than they ever have. And some of those very corporations are pushing for more and more war because they make money on it.
Right. And I think there's the big concern about the financial system and being able to dominate through domination of the institutions. If you make the rules that are in your favor, you win. If you can't do that anymore because you're no longer a sole superpower, I think it just seems like there are people crazy enough to think that a world war is the way to maintain their dominance. And I don't think it's just the military industrial complex, if you will, or at least we have to expand our view of that because it includes the financialization, it includes the banks and such, and always did. But I can remember in 2014 thinking, who would ever want to take us down a path toward another world war in the age of nuclear weapons? And even Brzezinski at that point in time, though he was advocating aggression against Russia via Ukraine, he was careful to say, well, of course, we'd never want a real war with Russia or anything else. And in just like 7 years, now it is much more of a warlike stance toward Russia. And there is talk about war with Russia. And I didn't listen to Putin's latest annual speech. And I think that the military part of it was a little bit overemphasized in some of the reporting on it because when I looked to see what the breakdown was of the topics, and there were like 6 other topics in addition to defense. But the things that I saw headlines were, um, basically his statements about what would happen if the aggression continued. And, it doesn't sound good. He also made some statements about how Russia would retaliate against the decision makers, which sounds like on American soil. Um, so it's just shocking that we've gotten from the point of no one would even think about the fact that we could get into an actual war with Russia, hot war with Russia, to the point where we are now. It's a I knew it was a slippery slope, but I didn't realize quite how steep that slippery slope was. I just wanted to mention one thing about, if you go back to the early 90s, and if you go back to what Wes Clark said in his infamous 7 countries in 5 years statement, well, the part of that a lot of people don't talk about was when he recalled a conversation with Wolfowitz. I think he said it was 91. And Wolfowitz told him that while the Soviet Union was collapsed, it was time to go in and, I think he said, clean up those Soviet client states in the Middle East. I don't think most people see the war in the Middle East, including Syria right now that continues, as being involving Russia, at least not until Russia intervened in 2015. But I mean, was that an underlying? How do you see that? Was it always an underlying thing? Because I've heard other people say, no, that's really nothing.
Yeah, well, I don't know what he was referring to, because I mean, Russia, outside Afghanistan, I don't know that Russia had any real client states in that region in any real way. What I think they did do is get rid of, or try to get rid of, every secular state that existed there, including Syria, which still stands. It's one of the last secular states in the region. I mean, what the U.S. has done, and it seems intentionally so, is to spread, jihadism throughout the Middle East to keep it into chaos. I mean, that's what the U.S. is now. It is the purveyor of chaos. The U.S. always talks about trying to stabilize countries. It's not, we never try to stabilize countries. We're trying to destabilize countries and destabilize the world, because the U.S. sees advantage to that. It sees in chaos the ability to intervene and to exploit resources in a way that a sovereign state would never let the U.S. do. And going back to your query about, how could anyone want a world war that could threaten, the very life on Earth? Well, I would ask, how have the capitalists continued to pursue policies which are already destroying the Earth, as we know, and already destroying the capacity of the Earth to hold human life and other life, of course. Some of this is irrational. Some of this is really just people wanting short-term profit and apparently not caring whether there's a tomorrow, which is just incredible and insane. But then there seems to be something else going on. I mean, you look at this obsession with space and Mars. Everyone wants to go to Mars, or at least the rich people, right?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't. Well, we don't, but it's the Musks, right, who want to go.
Well, they say it, yeah.
And it's Richard Branson. Well, they're starting to go. They've given up on this Earth. We have to recognize the fact that there are capitalists who think that we're done here, and that they're going to live in either on Mars or in space satellites, right? Space stations that revolve around the Earth. Very soon, you're going to be able to, not you or me, we don't have the money for this, but very rich people are going to be able to vacation in space on these
the hotels, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're looking at them as not hotels. They're going to be freaking apartment buildings.
Go ahead.
Well, go ahead, but leave us alone. The point is when you have the capitalists thinking they can leave this place and live somewhere else, that is very dangerous, because that means they are willing to put everything at stake. I always say, in the day, when technology was more primitive, even with just cars, early 20th century, or even till fairly recently, the capitalists had to live amongst us, right? They didn't have a choice. They lived in our cities. They lived sometimes in our neighborhoods, not mine, but they lived with us. They shared our roads, right? If they wanted to drive somewhere, they had to use our roads, so they had to upkeep the roads, right? And they had to upkeep the cities because they wanted to live there. They liked New York City. They liked Broadway. They liked their stuff. Given that, they had to do certain minimum things to upkeep these things that they used and that they lived in. This is an obvious point. Now, the rich, the super rich, they don't fly commercial. They fly their own private planes in their own private airports. They soon will have flying cars. I guess that's the next big innovation. They don't need to do anything for our infrastructure, right? Because it's not their infrastructure anymore. And now they don't need anything need to preserve this earth because they think there's something out there waiting for them. I mean, this is pretty scary stuff. Yeah. But I think they think that way.
Well, the problem is they need people to do the work.
No, they don't, because the robots, or at least they think they don't need it. That's the point. What reality is and what they think could be totally different things. But I think they see an existence for them without the need for the proletariat and the peasant, like the rest of us. And that is the scariest place we could be.
Yeah, I know. Well, there are plans for smart cities where there's total surveillance and automation and things like that. I mean, it's still not clear to me how many people we're talking about here that are, making these plans and have accumulated so much wealth. I don't know. Is it a few hundred? Is it a few thousand? Is it a few million? I really don't know. But yeah, I mean, I have those same concerns. It sounds totally crazy, but we have reached that point. And people write these things. We didn't come up with these things on our own. It's written down on paper. I personally, well, I don't even want to get into that. But so back to Wolfowitz, that's maybe relevant, maybe not. And back to Crimea. So what's the big deal? What do we care about Crimea?
Well, again, we care about it insofar as it is an important resource to Russia. I mean, again, let's go back that it had been part of Russia for centuries before Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine as a gesture in the 1950s, right? It then went back to Ukraine, but it was always a significantly Russian and Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian area. And before it was given up, it was a very important outpost for Russia. And now it is still again. And so, again, I think it's only important in the sense that it's important to Russia. So it's important to the West. The West wants to take that little area of cushion away from Russia. I mean, they want Russia to be laid bare. And the Russians see this, right? They see what is happening. That the West wants them fully exposed, and that's the interest.
Yeah, and I think the claims that they wanted the naval base to be a NATO base, I think, seem more and more credible as time goes on.
I think so. They want, yes. Again, they want to completely surround Russia.
Right, and the Black Sea, messing around in the Black Sea. I remember 2015-ish, I asked somebody who'd been in the Navy for years whether just whether the U.S. would start to have a presence in the Black Sea. And he was like, no, no. It was a ridiculous thought. And now, the escalation, this is the first one where, we're going to send destroyers in there. And there have been some skirmishes in the Black Sea in the past when we have sent ships in there. They seem to be pushing the Montreux Convention to its limits, and some people seem to see that as something that needs to be overcome, so that we can have more of a naval presence. There's talk about building 2 naval bases in Ukraine, which, I mean, fine. Ukraine has a navy and all that, but it's the fact that the NATO involvement in building the naval bases. Nobody thinks that it's just going to be Ukraine using those bases. And I guess then there's always this element of, grudges. Like, it was an embarrassment that during the coup in 2014 that Russia moved quickly and grabbed Crimea. There's talk about how there were plans for involving Turkey to come in and move on Crimea that were foiled by Russia. I have never seen confirmation of that, but I could believe it. So, you have first of all, the overall goals, and then you have like the personality things, generals with grudges, if you will, or intelligence people running operations who are upset that it didn't go the way, even though they got the government they wanted. They pretty much got what they wanted with Ukraine. They got now, troops on the border, but that sticking point being Crimea fell through, and somebody, seems to be mad about it and just intending to set that right. When I believe Putin when he says that that's a red line. I believe strategists who say that if there was any significant move to take back Crimea, that it could lead to a nuclear war. I take that seriously. Do you?
Well, yeah, just like the U.S. would see Hawaii as a red line, or Puerto Rico, or Guam. Of course, it's a red line, and we should take that seriously.
Another thing about Crimea I wanted to ask you, you have a lot of experience in observing elections and such. Do you seem to trust the polls and the various ways, the referendum, that the people of Crimea really did not want to remain part of Ukraine?
I do trust that.
And there were some follow-up polls, and
there have been, and all the polls show overwhelming support to be part of Russia. I mean, who wouldn't be? If you had a choice, would you want to be part of Russia or Ukraine, which is now at war with itself? Which, I mean,
yeah,
it's not even a close call, especially if you're an ethnic Russian. I mean, you're going to go with Russia. And again, these are major Western outlets like USA Today that are reporting on this. The people there are happy being part of Russia. So I believe it. Of course I do. And again, it stands to reason.
Yeah, I was just curious. I do too. I find it credible. I think people attempted to undermine it and failed. There was just no way they could, other than just making things up. There was no way they could. Anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, just that I think people should be concerned about this and need to press our government to pull back and stop this situation.
Yeah, ramp it down. I agree. All right. Thank you so much, Dan. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you very much.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Dan Kovalik. Follow Dan on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik and find his book at Skyhorse Publishing. This podcast, independent media, so listener support's really important. Rockfin.com/AroundTheEmpire, Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, or PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find it on any mobile podcast app, any podcast app, or at the website AroundTheEmpire.com, or Rockfin, Patreon, or YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.